What's going on, Dodgers Nation? D-Mag here, and today it's a special day because I'm joined by my man, Mr. Eric Sherman, and he wrote this fantastic book about the Los Angeles Dodgers and Fernandomania. It's a fantastic book. It's called Daybreak at Chavez Ravine, Fernandomania, and the Remaking of the Los Angeles Dodgers. You can get it on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Highly recommended, essential reading for Dodger fans. I devoured this thing. Eric Seinfeld has that quote where he says, that book was so good, I almost finished reading it. Hey, does not apply to this, okay? I've knocked out this thing. It's such a fantastic book. But yeah, man, such an exciting book, and congratulations.
Well, thank you so much for those kind sentiments and for having me on this show.
Yeah, no, we're going to get into it because, first of all, I would talk to you during spring training, and I was like, wait a minute, Eric, did you just hit the lottery? Did you strike gold? The fact that you released this book in the same year that the Dodgers are finally retiring number 34, Fernando Valenzuela's number. I mean, how great is that this book comes on this special year?
Well, I have a great story about that. So advanced copies of the books came out about 3 months ago. And one of the chapters in the book is entitled Legacy, where I go over, why in the world hasn't number 34 been retired yet? So I gave all the reasons. I interviewed people. And so 3 weeks later, after the advanced copies were sent out, I know the Dodgers received a few. The Dodgers make the announcement that they're retiring his number. So you know what? I'm owning it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big break, and I think that fans are going to be so excited to read it. But I think what makes this book so special is, look, I read all the sports books. I'm a sucker for a sports book, but a lot of times you're halfway through the book and I'm just reading stats that I already know and that kind of stuff. But this book, it tells the story of the Dodgers, it tells the story of Fernando Valenzuela, but also the complicated history of the Dodgers and this city. And that's where I want to start, because that is a topic that definitely a sensitive topic to a lot of Angelinos, a topic that I think people definitely need to know more about. And we'll really start right there with Dodger Stadium. I think one thing I love about your book too is the chapter titles. I think David and Goliath, it really resonated with me, because you look at, economically speaking, Dodger Stadium, it made a lot of sense, right? It created thousands of jobs. You bring in tax revenue. It's a massive attraction. We know O'Malley wanted to model it after Disneyland and try to bring stars in there. But you mentioned in the book that it was really a situation where, hey, why didn't O'Malley cut bigger checks for some of these people that were basically just taken out from their homes? And when you look at that history there with eminent domain and the city versus the Dodgers, who really is to really blame for that process? So was it a city thing? Did the Dodgers get involved? Or was it really a situation where they say, hey, we're going to use Chavez Ravine to build this baseball cathedral, and these people really are going to basically be displaced from their homes?
To be fair, I think it was more a city issue than anything else. So just to give some history, through eminent domain, the city wanted to take over the 300 acres of land on Chavez Ravine, which encompassed 3 Mexican-American neighborhoods, to build affordable housing for the greater good. And of course, Mexican-Americans were marginalized, paid 50, 60 cents on the dollar for the value of their homes. And many of them had lived in Chavez Ravine for 2, sometimes 3 generations. So when the Red Scare came along in the early 50s, this project was deemed to be at best socialist and for some politicians communist. So the project was scrapped. So now the city of Los Angeles was left with 300 acres of property that they really didn't know what to do with. Now, the people that remained, the Mexican-American families that remained, felt, well, we're in the clear now. There's no project. We can stay in our homes. But then 2,500 miles east, the Brooklyn Dodgers are looking for a new home. New York City planner Robert Moses was not accommodating, wouldn't help them find a location for a larger stadium or to enhance Ebbets Field, which only sat 28,000. So the city lured the Dodgers out to Los Angeles and said, look, I mean, this 300 acres. It's going to be right by a freeway entrance. It's going to be great. You can have your 56,000 seat stadium, and it's just going to be gorgeous. So the Dodgers were lured out there, and unfortunately, during the beginning stages of the building of Dodger Stadium, when they were leveling the ground, some of those families that remained were literally dragged from their homes and watched as their homes got bulldozed to the ground to make way for Dodger Stadium. So as you can imagine, that visual resonated naturally with Mexican Americans and Latinos, and it really stuck in their craw. And really until Fernando came along with Fernandomania in 1981, roughly 5% of Dodger Stadium was comprised of Mexican Americans and Latinos. It was a very white crowd. And Fernando, of course, changed all that. And nothing's changed since. 2 years later, 50-60% of the crowd is Latino and Mexican American.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the book that, look, I mean, you're talking about eminent domain. They basically forced 1,800 Mexican-American families from 3 neighborhood sections of Chavez Ravine, La Loma, Palo Verde, and Bishop. And I read through some of those parts that you just mentioned about families seeing their homes bulldozed. They've lived in those homes for 4 generations. And in just a matter of minutes, their homes are gone. Now, when you look at that history, it's just a bit of a dark history when you look at Dodger Stadium. But Fernando Valenzuela, he comes along and really changes just the entire relationship between the Dodgers and the Hispanic community of Los Angeles. The Jaime Jarrín mentioned that they were looking for a Mexican Sandy Koufax to try to repair that relationship. You mentioned less than 5% of the fans at Dodger Stadium were Hispanic. Now that number is really at over 50%. I mean, the Dodgers, they like to say, oh, we have 50,000 strong every night. Hey, if it wasn't Fernando Valenzuela, could probably be talking about 20, 30, 40,000 without that strong fan base. But yeah, I mean, you look it back now, I think one thing really sticks out to me was when in the book, you're saying that would O'Malley have considered building Dodger Stadium in Beverly Hills or Brentwood? And I think that really kind of put things into perspective. So, yeah, I mean, how big of a role did the Dodgers have in that decision? Or do you think it was just more like a sales job? I mean, we've heard the story of O'Malley being the helicopter looking down at Chavez Ravine and trying to make LA an attraction. But there was also Wrigley. There was also the other field that had 22,000 seats that you could have played there. Was there another location in Los Angeles that could have made more sense where you didn't have to displace so many families?
Well, I don't think they necessarily would have had to look elsewhere. I just don't know why they needed 300 acres. Those families could have remained. The Dodger Stadium and the surrounding parking area did not require 300 acres. That's massive. I believe that was more than 10 times the acreage of Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. Pushing the Mexican-American families out, I think was a real blemish. And to what you were saying before, I think a lot of this could have been resolved if the Mexican-American families that were forcibly removed, if they would have paid, if the city would have paid what those homes were worth, or if O'Malley had gone to his own pocket. And, we're not talking about a lot of families that remained. It just would have avoided a lot of the contentiousness, I think. And, I think what it comes down to is the Mexican Americans just wanted to be treated like proper citizens, and not marginalized and not pushed around by what was perceived to be this big New York corporation coming in and pushing them out.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book, that yes, they weren't getting the proper value for their property, basically being offered 30 to 40%, sometimes more or less, but it was a little more than money, right? They want to be treated with respect, and just the whole perception of the operation. You got a big Brooklyn Dodgers team that wants to come in LA and just kick these families out. So yeah, it's a very complicated history to say the least, but thankfully Fernando Valenzuela, he did a lot to really repair that relationship. And we're going to touch on Fernando next, because, I mean, you look at Fernando's story, and when you read it in your book, of course, I was very familiar with it, but when you laid out the way you did, it's just even more unbelievable. I mean, the youngest of 12 children, born on November 1st, 1960, in a mud brick house in Huaquila, Mexico, a town with no electricity, no running water. They did have that small baseball field. And I want to start right there. Talk about Fernando's humble beginnings and how he got into the sport of baseball.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that baseball field. It didn't have a backstop. There were no bleachers. I mean, it was as basic as it could possibly get. And I mean, he really came from nothing, which makes his story, made for Hollywood, because, he didn't speak any English when he arrived at Dodgers camp at age 19. Was taking English as second language class. And the other thing too is, besides the fact he was extremely shy, and he still is really shy today, despite having a very public job as the color guy with the Spanish language station. Despite all that, his shyness was really intense, and I think there were a few people that helped him out tremendously get over that. Jaime Jarrín, certainly one. One of the smart things the Dodgers did was they were ready for what you refer to as the Mexican Sandy Koufax. They had a Spanish language broadcasting team in place as early as 1958. And Jaime Jarrín worked as Fernando's interpreter during press conferences for over 6 years. Now, Fernando probably didn't need an interpreter after 3 or 4 years, but his shyness, he really relied on Jaime, and he was made to order. He also had Mike Brito, the scout that signed him. Mike Brito, as your Dodger fans know, was the man with the radar gun and the Panama hat and the big cigars behind home plate all those years, just a fixture. Well, Fernando lived with Mike his first full season in the big leagues, just to give him a family environment, because he was homesick. Like you said, he came from a big family, and now he's in L.A. And of course, there was Tommy Lasorda, who never saw a camera he didn't like, and absolutely took all the that remaining media pressure away from Fernando. You could say that Fernando had several father figures that really made that transition a lot easier from those humble beginnings.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that there was a fractured relationship with the Hispanic community and the Dodgers, but still there were some community outreach attempts. And the fact they did have the games there in Spanish on radio. And you mentioned in the book about Jaime Jarrín talking about having jobs in the winter, and they really didn't make very much money. So they did establish that early on. But kind of going along here with Fernando too, being in that media room myself, that really resonated with me, the way he carries himself there, because he clearly he has that glow to him. He's sitting right there. It's Fernando Valenzuela, but still, he's a very approachable, like you said, but still sometimes you see him with his AirPods in. It's like he'll give you answers, but still he's not going to be a guy that is going to jump out at you and try to bring attention onto himself. And I think that is so interesting, considering Fernando Mania and the spotlight that was shined on him. But kind of moving along in his journey to the bigs, I think it's really fascinating, really the next step. So the manager sees Fernando strike out 16 batters in the All-Star game, and he selects him to that Sonora All-Star game. Then Dodgers scout from Mexico, Carito Verona, he scouted him, and this was, I love how you had his original. I love reading reading scouting reports, and the original one had him saying Fernando was a little wild, but not much. He was plump, but not all over. His arms and legs are slim. He has a chance to make the major leagues. And then, of course, you mentioned Mike Brito, Dodgers legendary scout. He gets in the mix. LA eventually signs him for $120,000. That was the most they've ever spent on a prospect. They're really getting into a bidding war with the Yankees there. Now, the next question I have for you is, when you look at Mike Brito and his involvement with him, just how important was Mike Brito to Fernando Valenzuela and just the entire Fernando Mania phenomenon?
Well, extremely. Unfortunately, sadly, we just lost Mike Brito not that long ago. And Mike was terrific in this interview, in the interviews that I did with him. Just was a father figure all along for Fernando. He followed Fernando, when Fernando would get promoted throughout the minor leagues. Brito followed him, stayed with him, ate with him. He was a guardian angel to Fernando. There's no way to overstate the influence. And, I visited the Dodgers press box, right shortly before Mike passed away, and Mike was there. He was in a wheelchair, and he was visiting with Fernando, and he was a constant influence for Fernando. Until Fernando was 60 years old, he was always there. People should hope that they have a father half as supportive as Mike Brito. A tremendous figure. And, Mike Brito, aside from Fernando, in the annals of Dodgers history, with the players that he signed, it was just remarkable. He's easily the greatest scout of Mexican players in history. No one's even close.
Yeah, and there's a direct line from Fernando Valenzuela to Julio Urias and all this talent that the Dodgers have extracted from Mexico throughout the years. And it accomplished two things. It got them talented players that helped them win ball games, and two, helped them bring in an entire demographic into Dodger Stadium. So next question I have for you too is, how important is it was it just something that they were trying to accomplish, really two birds with one stone, find great players and Mexican stars? Or was it, hey, let's find a Mexican star that can also be a great player too, but really it's trying to focus on repairing that relationship?
I think they were looking for that next Mexican Sandy Koufax, and they had been. O'Malley and the Dodger brass, they were always going to Jaime Jarrín, saying, hey, can you find us the next Sandy? Like they wanted desperately to heal that relationship with Mexican Americans. And I think it went beyond what occurred with Chavez Ravine. I think it was also a growing Mexican American Latino population in Southern California that, it would be good for business. Let's call it what it was. But they were always on the lookout for talent. When they signed Fernando, he hadn't really developed a screwball yet. Castillo, of course, he taught Fernando the screwball, and that really changed everything. That took Fernando from being a good prospect to a tremendous prospect.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating. It's just another example how everything had to align. The stars aligned for Fernando Valenzuela to have success. And you talk about in the book how Fernando, he needed another pitch. And Al Campanis, he's talking to Mike Brito. And Mike Brito, he's the one who suggested maybe a curveball or maybe a screwball. And Al Campanis, he says, hey, we don't have anyone that throws a screwball. And he's like, wait a second, we do. It's Bobo, meaning Bobby Castillo, a guy that Brito had signed to the Dodgers. pitches, a guy that he had scouted. And Fernando, he learned that screwball pitch in a week. And after that, really, his career totally changed. That's what Mike Brito said. He said he was a different pitcher after that. We know, of course, the screwball is a pitch that essentially it's a curveball in reverse, as you pointed out in the book. But it was such a special screwball because it didn't just do one thing. He had three different types of pitches going side to side, up and down, one that could stay in the zone. Just talk about how that pitch changed his career and how really there is no Fernando Valenzuela without that screwball.
Absolutely. Somebody recommended that someone I really respect recommended that I call the book Screwball because you're absolutely right. I mean, it changed everything. It's an extremely difficult pitch to master. Carl Hubble was really the first pitcher to use it, and he used the screwball all the way to the Hall of Fame and struck out all those American League hitters in the first All-Star game. But very, very few have mastered it, and it just elevated Fernando from being a good pitcher to a phenomenal pitcher. Now, what it also did, it affected his career later on. You throw that screwball and enough, the number of innings that Fernando did. I mean, his first 6 seasons in the big leagues, he made the All-Star team 6 straight years, just like Sandy Koufax did. But it put so much stress on your arm that if you are overused, which Fernando was, and you may touch on that later. I mean, it will shorten the effectiveness of your career, and that's probably what happened to Fernando later on.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating pitch, and you don't see guys use it these days, and it's for that reason. Mainly is because it does take its toll. When you combine the effects of that pitch on your arm and then the usage of Fernando Valenzuela, we know that Tommy Lasorda did not like to go to his bullpen. It was just a different era of Major League Baseball with guys going deep into games. That is what probably led to him having a shorter career and just really his drop-off after he had such a great start. But yeah, you mentioned Carl Hubble. I love that part in the book where you talk about Christy Mathewson and Warren Spahn, guys that use that screwball, and the fact that Hubble even commented on Fernando Valenzuela's screwball, saying that it was the best that he had seen from that pitch since he threw it. So that's very high praise from him. But yeah, when you just look at highlights of it, I think, we have advanced metrics now. We have Baseball Savant that can show us what each pitch is every single time it comes out of the pitcher's arms. But still, I think as you see the variations of the speed, the side to side, it's really such a game-changing pitch. But now we got to talk about the start of Fernando Mania. And one comment I find very interesting was Mark Langell. And Mark Langell, he talks about how the Dodgers, they didn't go with Fernando Valenzuela in that playoff, that one-game playoff in 1980 against the Houston Astros. Of course, Tommy Lasorda, he goes with Dave Goltz, and then the rest is history. Phil Niekro, he pitched a phenomenal complete game. The Dodgers lose 7-1. Fernando Valenzuela had basically pitched less than a month. He was 19 years old, but Dusty Baker talks about it in the book how, hey, they should have gone Fernando Valenzuela and maybe they win that series. But talk about Mark Langell's comment that had Fernando pitch in that game and maybe the Dodgers win, how you don't have Fernando Mania the following year.
Yeah, first of all, I have to say that Mark is an incredible baseball mind, just amazing. There's nobody that I enjoy talking baseball with more than Mark. He is an encyclopedia. So to your point, and to Mark's point, Fernando pitched 17 shutout innings in the fall of 1980, but they weren't. Well, none of them were starts. He didn't start a game. And a lot of those innings were, they didn't close out games. So, they might be in the 7th inning or the 8th inning or extra innings but he was basically pretty much perfect. And he did not start that 163rd game against Houston. And believe me, the players I talked to, Dusty Baker and Rick Monday, I mean, they all wanted Fernando to start that game, even though it would be his first professional start over Goltz. who was, the high prize or high price free agent signing. Lasorda goes with Gultz, and you don't get fired if you're a manager going with a free agent pitcher. But you can get fired. Not that Lasorda would have gotten fired. It's more or less an expression. But a manager could get fired for going with a rookie pitcher, basically pitching his first start in a one-game playoff. So in a sense, what Mark Langelo's point was, it was a great thing for the Dodgers in a strange sort of way. It kept him in the witness protection program. So nobody really knew what the Dodgers had until he was forced upon the league when Jerry Royce and Bert Hooton, their two top pitchers going into that 81 season, were both injured like right before opening day, and their other two pitchers weren't available because they had pitched in the Freeway Series against the Angels. So they had to go with Fernando, and Fernando had ice in his veins. I talked about how shy he was in public, but that was anything but the case once he was on that mound.
Yeah, no, you definitely get a sense of fearlessness, that competitive fire. He was never afraid of the big moment. But yeah, I think that is such a great point that you made just now in Tommy Lasorda, and just adding some context, because this is before Lasorda gets his World Series in 1981. It was before he got his another World Series in 1988. Yes, they did make it a back-to-back World Series in 77 and 78, but I think a lot of Dodger fans, you look back on Tommy Lasorda's history, it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, just like it is now with Dave Roberts. They love Dave Roberts, but they also are he's the guy they always point to anytime something goes wrong. I mean, they blame Dave Roberts for the sinking of the Titanic, and it was the same with Lasorda back in the day. So yeah, I think that's important to point out. But also, I love that you point out in the book too, he was spectacular in his 10 appearances that came in relief when he was 19 there in 1980. But also, if you go all the way back to his minor league numbers, I mean, he was running a 52 2/3 scoreless inning streak dating all the way back to San Antonio. And also, too, he did pitch in that game 163, had 2 scoreless innings. So it was a precursor of things to come. And you talked about opening day in 1981. Just another layer of, okay, one thing broke this way to allow Fernando Mania to happen. And as you mentioned, Jerry Royce, he was supposed to start. He was a late scratch due to that calf muscle strain. Bert Hooton, for me, I was cringing a little bit when I learned about, of course, that painful ingrown toenail removal. He couldn't start. Then, as you mentioned, Bob Welch had the bone spur, and then other two guys, Rick Sutcliffe and Dave Goltz, they had pitched in that Freeway Series that we see every year, the last 2 games of spring training. So you turn to 20-year-old Fernando Valenzuela, and he was fantastic. 5-pitch shutout on 106 pitches. The Dodgers win 2-0, and then Fernando Mania really gets started. And if you look at the numbers to start Fernando started his career with the Dodgers, is absolutely mind-blowing. I just don't think we're ever going to see this again in Major League Baseball. He pitched 9 innings in each of his first 8 starts. He allowed 4 earned runs. He had 5 shutouts, an 8-0 record. And in his first 89 2/3 innings of his Major League career, he had 51 hits, 22 walks, and 84 strikeouts and a .4 ERA. Just talk about how he was on the mound, how dominant his career started.
Well, I mean, like you said, 8-0, 5 shutouts, 0.50 ERA. I mean, we could just call it what it is. It was the greatest start to a starter's career in the history of the game, and remains so today. But it wasn't just what he was doing on the mound that was so incredible. I mean, he was almost immediately after that opening day start, the Dodgers were getting 15,000 advanced ticket sales, for his next start. If Lasorda was going to move him up a day or back a day, I mean, they had to put out a press release to let the fans know, because, they're going out of their way to buy these tickets to come see him pitch. So, these early April, beginning of May games where they might draw 30,000, I mean, they were selling them out. Fernando Mania, it was organic, and it really happened instantly. It happened in that first game. The fans got caught up into it, and that's something else that I don't think we'll ever see again. I mean, the fervor and the enthusiasm, and how Dodger Stadium on nights that he pitched transformed into, regular old Dodger Stadium to really a Mexican festival, with flags and banners, Mexican flags and banners all over the stadium, mariachi bands, fans making their own Fernando T-shirts and makeshift jerseys, because they didn't sell jerseys like they do now in those days. Of course, you had that young lady that ran on the field, and just I think when she ran on the field and gave Fernando a hug and a kiss, I think she personified what the 55,000 fans in attendance that night all wanted to do. It was like a 55,000 fan kiss and hug to Fernando, and the mania, the excitement was so quick. I don't know if you'll get into this later, but Fernando was barely a big leaguer for 3 months, and he gets invited to the White House. And he's the star of the luncheon. Everyone, including the president of the United States, is asking for his signature. So it was so quick, the mania, and it just spread throughout the country, and not just Dodger Stadium. The night that he went 8-0, the Dodgers were in New York, and they were playing a Mets team in '81 that wasn't just a bad baseball team, but they were terribly boring, and they would draw 5,000 to 6,000 fans a night. And even the game before Fernando pitched on a Friday night, a game against the Giants, they only drew about 6,000 fans. Well, the night that Fernando pitched, the announced crowd was 43,000, but that was paid, so there was over 50,000. So Fernando was bringing Mexican Americans out of the shadows for the first time, not just at Dodger Stadium, but all over the country, and bringing women out to games for the first time too.
Yeah, I know he was an absolute rock star, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I find that moment fascinating with Norma Echevarria, who goes on the field, gives him a kiss. Like you mentioned, she actually did have her own number 34 jersey. And back then, it wasn't like it is today where you just go to millions of stores and get jerseys. I mean, people had to find a way to get those things. And look, if that happens today, we're talking about probably the most viral moment in sports for that year, for someone to come out of the stands and kiss a player like that. And I think, too, it definitely exemplifies just kind of how the fan base and really the entire country was just so enamored with this guy. And I think he had that mystique factor, too. I think that's something about him, is the fact that he was a little shy. I think that kind of almost endeared him to the fan base as well. They just wanted to know more. I found it really interesting in the book when it talked about how news reporters would go down to Mexico and they wanted to learn everything about this guy, when usually it's the other way around, right? So yeah, it was an absolute fascination. You mentioned too in New York. I mean, just visualizing 100 reporters just cramming into just places and press scrum to try to get anything they can from a guy. To me, I just don't think we're going to see anything like that again. I wanted to ask you too about his delivery. My favorite baseball movie of all time is Bull Durham, and you mentioned the scene with Susan Sarandon and Nuke LaLoosh, and she says to him, "Have you ever noticed how Fernando Valenzuela doesn't even look when he pitches? He's a Mayan Indian or Aztec. I get them confused." Have you ever found out about that delivery where he's looking up to the sky? I mean, where does that come from?
I was not able to find that out. And that eyes to the sky delivery where he literally would shut his eyes and then pick up, Socha's or Jaeger's glove. And it was just so iconic, and was mimicked, of course, on playgrounds, backyards, little league fields, all over the country, and probably all over the world, wherever baseball's played. I mean, I did it in my backyard playing wiffle ball. You throw a Fernando in there along with a Louis Tiant, and it was just so iconic. And to what you were saying a moment ago about his relatability, he was not a physical specimen. He looked somewhat out of shape. He had kind of a strange haircut, but again and again in my interviews, particularly with Mexican Americans, they would tell me he reminded them of their older brother or their uncle. There was this everyman way about him, and that shyness where it was just something they could relate to, like he was one of them. But what it also did was it inspired them. If Fernando can be the very, very best at his profession, looking like one of us, well, then maybe we could be a ball player, or maybe we could be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a professional. That to me is the real theme of this book. It's his impact that he had on millions of people, not necessarily even baseball fans. But to what I was saying before about bringing women out to the ballparks, I mean, he had Mexican American Catholic women coming to the ballpark, praying for him to do well. He was to the Mexican Americans what Jackie Robinson was to the African Americans. In my mind, it's a clear comparison. And I also make the comparison of Fernando to Cesar Chavez. Both didn't really enjoy speaking in front of crowds. Both weren't these physical specimens that you might expect a leader to be, but they both inspired and impacted so many people. So Fernando really, he's just a hero to so many, even if he never sought that or never looked for it. And he still doesn't look for it today. And I just hope that if Fernando reads this book, that it may enlighten him on the immense impact that he's had on so many.
But thanks for watching part 1 of the impossible rise of Fernando Valenzuela. I want to thank my guest, Eric Sherman. You can pick up his new book, Daybreak at Chavez Ravine, Fernandomania and the Remaking of the Los Angeles Dodgers, wherever you get your books. Stay tuned for part 2, and if you haven't yet, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and if you want to see us post even more Dodgers content, you really want to support the channel, smash that like button. My name is Doug McCain. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at DMac_LA, and until next time, think blue, bleed blue, and I'm out.